This is Duke University.
Welcome all of you to today's presentation, which is part of the Duke Project on Custom and Law, and which is sponsored by the Duke Center for International and Comparative Law. I'm Professor Kathy Bradley, and I'm here today with my colleague, Professor Esther Accolazzi of the Duke Divinity School. It's been our privilege together to work with the 11 students that you see here in a seminar this semester entitled Integrating Legal Frameworks, Customary Law, Statutory Law, and Spousal Property Rights in Ghana, which is a long title. But as it suggests, the courses involved a comparative law examination of the law in Ghana as it relates to spousal property rights, which are currently in a state of flux in Ghana and are the subject of pending bills in the Ghanaian parliament. And as the title of the course suggests, this isn't just about custom and law, but it's about customary law, which is part of Ghana's common law and is defined as such by its constitution. But this hasn't been your typical seminar, as you might be able to tell from the food, the drums, the clothes. Instead of just having weekly class sessions, which we have done, we also traveled over a spring break to Ghana so the students could meet with the various stakeholders that we had been learning about in the coursework before we went. We met with government leaders, with religious leaders, community leaders, and leaders of NGOs, and you're going to hear about that from the students. Today, we'd like to tell you about what we learned both in the classroom and in Ghana, and what we're doing now to try and further the cause of spousal property rights in Ghana. What we're going to do today is that in a minute, I'm going to ask Professor Accolazzi to come up and make a few remarks, and then we're going to hear from each of the students who's going to explain something about the legal issues and about what we did when we were there. After that, I'm going to pose some questions to the students, and some of them are going to respond, and then we'll take questions from the audience. We're also going to have a slide presentation as part of that. Before we go through that, though, I do want to offer some thanks. First, I want to thank the Center for International Comparative Law, which has sponsored this trip and helped fund it, as they have for prior trips to Haiti, to Brazil, and to Israel. I also want to thank the Dean for his support, and particularly to Associate Dean Gail Hallenbeck, I think is here, who was immensely helpful in all the logistical and financial things that had to be done to make this trip work. Also to Sharon Seabolt and Ali Prince for their administrative help, to the Duke Law faculty, who contributed more than 130 books that we carried with us to Ghana, to the Law Institute, which is run by Hilary Bedema, our partner there, to replenish and update their law library there, which has shelves, about as much shelf space as any of our professors have in one of our offices, and we took about, like I said, 130 books weighing about 500 pounds that we carried with us there. So thanks to the faculty for supporting that. And also thanks today to drummer extraordinaire David Bradley, who's playing a genuine Ghanaian drum to get us off to a good start today. So now I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague Esther Accolazzi from the Divinity School.
Good afternoon. Esther Accolazzi is my name. I'm from Ghana by way of various other places in the U.S. and currently teach in the Divinity School, where I have been privileged to co-teach with your Professor Kathy Bradley in my marriage and family class. For those who might be wondering what a bunch of African Americans and white people could be offering to us as Ghanaians, our people say that the one clearing a path usually cannot see whether the path he or she is clearing is straight or not. It takes someone looking from behind, usually from afar off. You know, the law of perspective. It's usually someone from afar off who can tell whether the path is straight or not. So in many ways, this is what this class offered to us as Ghanaians trying to figure out this law that is going to soon hopefully be passed. That they provided what you might call a sounding board for us to hear what we have been saying and how we are pushing the law. And we are here to say that they did a very wonderful job, and we're grateful. Thank you.
So now what we're going to do is each of the students is going to give you a piece of the law and of the things that we learned about. They're going to keep these presentations really brief and very basic, so which is the challenge in itself. But it's part of the challenge of some of the writing we've been doing since we came back from Ghana, to try and explain things in very simple terms. And so we're going to start off with Chris Liefers, who's going to talk to us about the forms of law in Ghana. You can stand up, or you can come here if you like. It's your choice. Come up here.
Okay, so first in this class, we had to understand the sources of law in Ghana so that we could then understand what was going on with the changes of laws in Ghana. So the supreme law of the land there is the Constitution of 1992, and it's somewhat similar to our U.S. Constitution, but it also has a lot more articles and provisions than our Constitution has. And then within the Constitution, it lists the other sources of law in Ghana. They have parliamentary statutes, so those are laws that are passed by the parliament. Rules, orders, and regulations that are passed by people given authority within the Constitution. So an example of that would be the president could make an order, and that would become law. They also recognize existing law. So that means the laws that were in place in Ghana prior to 1992, when the new Constitution was brought into place. And then the last area of law in Ghana is common law. And they recognize the common law as being what we would consider common law, equity law, and the customary law. And customary law differs by community. That's how it's defined in the Constitution. So there can be a lot of variance from one region to another, or from one community within a city or a region. So very briefly, those are the laws of Ghana.
There's a lot more to it. She gave you a very good condensed view of that. All right, so Ben Caston's going to tell us a little bit about the basics in terms of Ghanaian culture concerning particularly family structure and property ownership.
So I think I'll just probably stand here since we got a lot more people to go through. Can you all hear me in the back? All right. So one of the issues that we dealt with in thinking about and talking about these new laws was the traditional conception of family and property. And a lot of the most important property in Ghana, at least traditionally, has been land and other real property that belonged to the family or to the chief, to the clan. And so as the nuclear family has become more important, a lot of the importance of different kinds of property has changed as well. And so one thing that we've thought about is how that changing conception of family from the more extended family where you have a clan, a tribe, to a nuclear family has affected the way property is divided. And that's one of the issues that we had to confront in terms of people's expectations about who would get property, especially upon death or divorce.
And Ali Heaney's going to talk about the forms of marriage in Ghana. In the U.S., we basically have one, but Ghana has more than that.
So one of the tricky parts about assessing any of these bills and laws is that there are three forms of marriage in Ghana. Customary law marriages, ordinance marriages, and Mohammedan marriages. Two of these three are polygamous or potentially polygamous. The customary law marriage and the Mohammedan marriage. The ordinance marriage is comparable to our form of marriage. It's monogamous and it's statute-based.
Thank you. Now, we were studying in particular two laws. One relates to intestate succession law, that is, what happens to property when a spouse dies and what happens to whether the other spouse gets property. And the other law that we're looking at is the Property Rights of Spouses Bill, which talks about what happens when a couple divorces. We understand in the U.S. what happens and how property gets divided. In Ghana, they don't have laws in place right now, and so there are bills pending to deal with this. And so we're going to talk to you about each of those bills. Haley Warden's going to talk about the intestate succession bill that's now pending and why we need it.
I'll jump up too. The intestate succession bill is actually a follow-up to an existing law on intestate succession, meaning what happens to property when someone dies without a will. In Ghana, there are matrilineal and patrilineal forms of kind of inheritance that were traditional. And in those systems, essentially spouses are not considered part of one another's clan. So you don't marry into your spouse's clan, you remain part of your kind of home group. And so the original intestate succession law was intended to sort of recognize the increasing economic importance of the nuclear family by giving a share of a deceased spouse's property to that person's spouse and children. But the current law had some problems that this bill, which hopefully will pass soon, was trying to correct. One of those was that there was no provision for jointly acquired property. So oftentimes, especially if it was the breadwinner, typically the husband that died, any property that the spouses acquired together would be considered entirely his property, and his spouse wouldn't get any more than the typical spouse's share. So joint property, another was that polygamy was not kind of fully accounted for in the original law. So the new law was trying to maybe deal with some of those problems. Another issue was that the current law doesn't have any provision for dependent children or minor children. It gives the same amount of the estate to adult children as it would to minor children. So there were some problems there. And then just one of the biggest problems, which is one that will remain, is enforcement and education. A lot of people don't know about the law. They don't know it applies to them. So these are all kind of some issues with the current state of the law that we were dealing with.
Thank you. We're also dealing with the Property Rights of Spouses Bill, which, as I said, would deal with property division at divorce. And there's currently no law on the books for that in Ghana, although there are some principles that deal with it in terms of equity, and there's constitutional provisions that specify that a law should exist. So Katie McEvely is going to tell us a little bit about the bill.
So distributing property at divorce is currently governed by the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1971. And under this act, as Haley was mentioning, property just belongs to the person who bought it or who acquired it. And the problem is that in Ghana, that's often the man. It's always the husband who's the breadwinner. The act does not recognize household contribution to give you a property interest. And so in order for a homemaker to gain property interest, she would have to show a substantial financial contribution, which is often difficult to prove under the act. So depending on the region, a wife at divorce might receive cloth or a drink or some small monetary send-off, but she wouldn't be entitled to any property. So the problem is that the Constitution requires an equitable distribution of property at divorce, and this hasn't been given any life in Ghana. So the Property Rights of Spouses Bill will assume that a 50-50 split of joint property is an equitable distribution, and then it has a list of 9 factors to divide the property as is fair.
Well, so when we heard about these bills, we thought, well, of course, this is perfectly logical. Why doesn't Ghana pass them right away? Because in a lot of ways, they look very much like U.S. laws and what we're used to in terms of what happens at divorce or at death when a person dies without a will. But these bills are facing difficulties in the Ghanaian parliament and in Ghanaian society in terms of passage. And so one of the things that we've learned about is what the difficulties are and what issues that the people are encountering with the groups that are trying to implement these bills. Emily May is going to talk to us a little bit about the problems that have come up with the ISB, the Intestate Succession Bill.
Well, there are fewer controversies with the Intestate Succession Bill than with the Property Rights of Spouses Bill that deals with divorce, but there are still problems with the Intestate Succession Bill, and I'm just going to highlight a couple. First, as Haley noted, the ISB is designed to give a larger proportion of the estate to the spouse and to the children than is normally the case under existing law. But that in itself is controversial because whenever one group is getting more, that necessarily means that another group is getting less. And not everyone in Ghana accepts the idea that the law should put more emphasis on the nuclear family. Second, and relatedly, the ISB defines joint property as property in which each of the parties made a substantial contribution. And like it does for the PRSB, contribution includes both financial and non-financial aspects, and so that means, for example, the role that a homemaker might play. And in America today, that idea is largely accepted, but it is a change from current law in Ghana, and it demands a change in thinking about how Ghanaians conceive property and what is joint property for both spouses together, as opposed to what is separate. And so that also is controversial.
Thank you, Emily. Amy Okoji is going to tell us about the problems with the Property Rights of Spouses Bill, which are more numerous than with the Intestate Succession Bill.
So, as has been stated, the Property Rights of Spouses Bill is the contentious bill right now. There are two main issues with that bill. One is the cohabitation clause, and the other is the contribution in kind clause. The cohabitation clause recognizes couples that have lived together for 5 years and held themselves out to be married as long as they have the capacity to be married, so age and things like that. The problem that the bill has been having is that a lot of people see it as writing immorality into the Constitution. They see it as writing something into the Constitution that Ghanaian society has traditionally explicitly rejected. However, as Ben mentioned, Ghanaian society is changing, and there are many reasons that people might choose to cohabit instead of going through the formal marriage rights, which I don't have the time to explain right now. The other controversial piece is the contribution in kind. Contribution in kind recognizes the contributions that a homemaker may have made to the wealth that a family has acquired, because traditionally the man is the breadwinner. The problem with this is that the paradigm of Ghanaian marriage is that, as opposed to the U.S. paradigm where we view marriage as a partnership, their paradigm is that it's roles you play. So the wife plays a certain role and the husband plays a certain role, and the wife's role just happens to encompass those homemaker responsibilities. So they see it as paying her to do what is essentially her job as a wife.
Thank you. I'm going to add a couple things to clarify about the cohabitation piece because it's very complicated. Here in the U.S., we do not grant spousal property rights to couples that have just lived together, and that's the big distinction between marriage and just cohabitation. But because of Ghana's different forms of marriage and the form of customary marriage, what often happens is that couples will have started the customary rights but not completed them for a variety of reasons, and may end up then living together for years or decades and having children together, but unless those rights have been completed, they're not viewed as married at the time the couple dissolves its union, and so they're not entitled to divorce proceedings. And so this is a very serious issue. The contribution issue is also important because we recognize in the U.S. that contribution between spouses is it's a part of how we value what members of a marriage do. And we've long understood that a lot of non-monetary contribution can count. Ghana hasn't gotten to that point yet, and it's essentially at the point where the U.S. was when it was sticking to a strictly title form of property in terms of property ownership and divorce not so very long ago in our past. So the issues are not so unfamiliar if you're looking at things from a historical perspective in the U.S. So you've heard a little bit about the substance. Karen Gift is going to try and explain what we did in Ghana to learn about these issues after we learned about them in the classroom.
So since we did have this opportunity to go to Ghana, we tried to squeeze as many diverse perspectives into the 9 days in Ghana as we could. And since this is an issue that cross-cuts politics, law, and culture, we tried to get perspectives from within each of those areas. So we talked with parliamentarians, specifically the parliamentarians who were part of the committee that's currently reviewing the PRSB. We talked to representatives of the Ministry of Women and Children, which is an official government agency that kind of operationalizes a lot of these issues. We met with judges, both in the High Court in Accra, at the capital of Ghana, as well in Ho, which is a provincial capital of a Volta region. We met with church leaders, school teachers, additionally NGOs from a variety of human rights, women's groups, domestic violence organizations, to try to get a read about how different people and different stakeholders felt about these issues. And so through all those meetings, we learned a lot of interesting things, and hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that as the presentation continues.
Thank you. And we've got slides that are showing now from some of the things places we went to with some captions that'll give you a clue. It was a very, very full agenda, as the students will all attest to. We'll talk about the fun we had as well. Candace Reeder's going to give us a report on where things stand now, based on what we learned in Ghana.
Okay, so right now the short story would be that we would be surprised if the intestate succession bill did not pass, and we would be pleasantly surprised, actually, if the Property Rights of Spouses Bill passed. The intestate succession bill, as you've already heard, is less controversial, and so there's less likelihood that it's going to be stopped, where the Property Rights of Spouses Bill, because it requires such a significant paradigm shift in how we look at marriage as a partnership and the contribution of spouses, there's a lot more resistance, both within Parliament, and Emily thinks this is particularly juicy, but there's some of the members of Parliament are not as helpful in promoting the bill as they could be, but also within the public. And our hope would be that if the intestate succession bill passes, the definition of contribution that is in the Property Rights of Spouses Bill is exactly the same. So that might help kind of make the transition a little bit smoother.
Thank you. And I'll give a couple of other pieces to update. There's a lot of discussion now. We don't even have the latest version of the intestate succession bill, but we know they've done some tweaking it to try and get it to pass. With the Property Rights of Spouses Bill, they're having so much resistance on the cohabitation piece. There have begun to be conversations about dropping that part out of the bill. And part of the question is, does that keep enough of the bill intact? And there have been some strategic decisions about that still are in the works. One of the other issues that's affecting the bills is that this is an election year in Ghana. Now, you kind of roll your eyes and you think, we know what it means if it's an election year. And we know what happens in the U.S. in an election year, that a lot of things get shoved aside for campaigning. But Ghana, that's true, and then there's some other issues, because Ghana is a fairly young democracy. It became a democracy in 1957. We were actually there for its Independence Day celebration. I think you'll hear some more about that, which is on March 6th. And so things are fairly fragile. Ghana is a safe place and a safe democracy now. A lot of the region very close to Ghana is not. And so there's a lot of resistance to trying to get legislation like this passed in a year when the presidential election's being held, when Parliament's up for election, and so forth. And so frankly, if these bills don't get passed by this summer, we expect they will be tabled until next year, and we'll see whether they get revived after that. So we're watching to see what happens. So Ashley Gray's going to tell us what we're doing to see if we can make these bills become law.
So as everyone discussed while we were in Ghana, we learned quite a bit about not only the bills, but the perceptions of the bill within the public, and also among Parliament and other NGOs that were working on the passage of these bills. So our main goal was to try to figure out how we could be helpful in informing the public and also ensuring its passage. So what we're doing now are creating documents, essentially two. One that will be a frequently asked questions document that very quickly and briefly goes through the law, why it's applicable in this case, and how different definitional sections of the laws will apply. And so that, the motivation for that is that for a lot of NGOs, they had an issue with disseminating information to the public and also to other organizations. So we wanted a central document where they could get a lot of these questions about terms of the legislation answered. And in addition to that, we're also putting together a judicial guide that will inform judges of how the different terms that we've talked about, like cohabitation, like equitable distribution, how they should be applied. And that will cite to case law and also the way that it has been applied in the past. Equitable distribution has always been a part of the Constitution, but the way that it's been applied has been varied. So this document will help explain in the future, moving forward, if these laws are passed, how it would actually apply within the law.
One of the things we're hoping to help with the judicial training is that we will have at the Judicial Institute here at Duke this summer for its inaugural year an appellate judge from Ghana as one of the judges who will be attending. So we're hoping to be able to build that connection to work with the judicial training materials. Well, we did some other things in Ghana besides attend numerous meetings, and John Doyle's going to tell us some of those. He gets the fun stuff.
So everything we did there, the work was obviously very memorable, but everything outside of work was memorable too. From learning their cool handshakes to buying things out of the window of our bus. And by the way, our bus was like this awesome, fully windowed, 20-seat thing. It like belonged on Road Trip from MTV. It was really cool. You get to go all around the country. But I'll break down what we did into three categories: nature and sightseeing, food and nightlife, and history. So from the nature sightseeing perspective, the first day while we were there, we got to take a river tour on a boat of the Accra River, and we got to ride past some fishing villages, and we got to see one of West Africa's largest dams, and we learned a little bit about how people were displaced and the impacts of that and what can be done to try to mitigate the impacts on the local communities. We had plans to go to a monkey reserve and to do a canopy walk, but we got rained out. But to be honest, I mean, the whole topography and landscape was so beautiful that all the trips between the cities were pretty mesmerizing themselves. Food and nightlife, almost every morning we had to be up by like 6:30, 7:30. So we had to be really cautious of how we spent our downtime. We did get to go to a few restaurants. We got to try Ghanaian beer and palm wine. And I think 4 of the nights while we were there, we found ourselves dancing, usually not by our own volition, usually because Ghanaians would pull us up and force us to, but everybody was a good sport. I think everybody danced at some point, which was cool. And then probably the most memorable aspect was the historical trip that we did on Independence Day. We took a 4-hour trip west along the coast, leaving from the capital of Accra, going to Cape Coast Castle. And Cape Coast Castle has a long history. It's a trading port that traded hands between a lot of different European countries, but it was one of the largest sites where slaves would be traded in and out of. And we went down, and this was on Independence Day, mind you, so there were a lot of people out and around. And we got to go into the dungeons where people were just kept in squalid, awful conditions for multiple weeks, having no idea when they would leave. And we got to go through, we saw the door of no return where people would leave knowing that they wouldn't return. But throughout that tour of Cape Coast, we were being led by who I found to be a really inspiring tour guide who helped people handle their emotions and keep an optimistic vision moving forward. So I think that was a great part of the trip.
Thank you. Okay, so now I have a few questions, just sort of more general questions. You've heard some of the specifics, and I'm going to ask particular students to respond to these, just to give you some other perspective. So one of the first questions that we asked ourselves when we were talking about this last week as a debriefing was, how did we view our role in Ghana? So I'm going to ask some of you to tell what you thought your role was. And John, I'll start with you. So how did you view your role in Ghana?
Very cautiously. I think we all were really cautious because obviously, a bunch of Americans going over there to learn. The issue is that people were worried that we were going to be advocating for something that we didn't really know what's best for Ghanaians. So I think we were really conscious of trying to not guide the advocacy, but to use our skills and our resources to help the NGOs that we were working with in any way that they would like to use us.
Katie, do you have something to add to that?
Sure. I think we were all so immersed with the bills and with the reading before we went over there that we were all really eager to help and we wanted to be put to good use. I think when we got there, we were probably more, like Professor Akalatsi said, like a sounding board. We truly were students, researchers, listening and pushing back a little bit, but we weren't really the advocates that maybe I had imagined before going.
Haley, you agree with that, or you want to add something more?
I agree.
Okay. Okay. We've already talked a little bit about how our perceptions changed, but I'll ask more directly if your perception of your role changed from before you went to Ghana to after we came back. Chris, what do you have to say?
I don't think my personal perception of our role changed all that much. I went into it, like they were saying, with the idea that we were going to learn a lot and not be trying to direct advocacy in one certain direction. And I feel like with all of the people who we met with while we were in Ghana, we were really able to listen a lot and gain a lot of new insight and continue with our educational role and with our support role through the NGOs.
Allie, how about you?
So one thing that I feel like I really recognized when I got there that I didn't see coming was how important cultural sensitivity is. And no matter how many times you say it, until you get there and you hear these stories, you just can't be you're not sufficiently humbled or sufficiently culturally sensitive. One of the anecdotes that someone told us in a meeting was about women who had been walking 2 or 3 miles to get water for their families, like twice a day, and some outside group installed a well in the center of the village so that they didn't have to walk, and that sounds like a good idea to me, like running water. I would like that. And the women were really disappointed and unhappy because that 2 or 3 mile walk was the time that they spent with other women and like got a rest from their family and their husband and chatted with each other. So I just think that's a really good example of, we're not Ghanaian, so I really felt like a student when I was there, and I felt really appreciative that the Ghanaians were willing to teach me something about that.
Ben, do you have anything to add to that?
It was pretty good.
One other thing I should add on the cultural sensitivities, we did some cultural sensitivity work before we went. I had the students do some reading, and one of the things that they were warned about was that it would be common for them to receive marriage proposals while they were there. So you all kept track, right, of who had the most? And I think Chris won. Is that correct? Okay.
Correct, yeah.
Okay. But John got one. For gender parity, John got one as well. And so it wasn't just the women. And as far as I know, there were no actual customary marriages that were completed by any of our group. Okay. Professor Hillary Bedema, who was with us, received one as well at the farewell dinner from a guy who was at the restaurant that night. So, that's one of the things to watch out for. So why was it important to go to Ghana, aside from getting the clothes and going to Cape Coast and having the cuisine and all that? Emily, what would you say about that?
Well, obviously, before the trip, I was really excited to go to Ghana. I definitely wanted to go, but I didn't fully understand why it was important for our project and for the work we were doing, because we read a lot of sources before we went, and I felt like we were learning a lot even before. But it became pretty clear to me during the meetings that we had with all the various groups, because we couldn't understand all of the diverse perspectives and all of the push both for the bills and the pushback against the bills. And it became most clear to me when we met with a couple parliamentarians who sat on the committees that were reviewing the bills. And this is what Candace referred to earlier as what I found really juicy. One of the parliamentarians, they were both very polite and respectful and willing to talk to us. And they were both, elected officials, very diplomatic, but one was fiercely opposed to the bills. And it would have been difficult to understand his reactions if we hadn't been there actually talking to him. We picked up a lot based on body language, based on the questions that he didn't really want to answer of ours. And also, frankly, he became a lot more conversational and open with us during the time that we sat with him and talked to him in a way that he might not have if we had just emailed him random questions and we were strangers. He might have had a lot less open reactions. And so I think for me at least, and I think from talking to other members of the group, being there and actually conversing about the bills and the whole aspect of culture too that Allie mentioned was incredibly key and important for us in learning about the bills and for our work now.
Karen, what can you add to that?
I would agree with everything Emily said. I think in addition to that point is there's a certain candidness, kind of building what you said, when you're talking with someone face to face. And so that's something I really appreciated. And second, I think there's a certain, I don't know if you want to call it serendipity, to being in a place and just the unexpected opportunities you have to learn. I think one instance we had gone that morning to a magistrate court, and the magistrate actually was out of town. It was unexpected, so we weren't able to meet with him. But on short notice, Professor Bedema, who was our contact and guide there, was able to get us into the High Court, and it turned out the High Court was actually hearing a divorce proceeding. And so while that's normally done in camera, with the judge alone, in this case the judge said, well, we'll let our guests listen in on this. And so it was an amazing opportunity to witness firsthand what we were learning that wouldn't have happened had we not been in Ghana.
John, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I would just say we got to hear the viewpoints of people who you wouldn't see their viewpoints online in academic articles or in judges' opinions that are available online. And that was really important because I think we realized something that we hadn't heard before we got there, which is that one of the biggest barriers is the issue of access to justice for women. And we heard that from every person we talked to, is that even if these are implemented, there's going to be serious challenges for women to actually be able to assert their rights because there's significant financial, time, and social stigma costs to actually using the court system in Ghana.
Ashley, I know you did Duke in D.C. last semester, and you've done this semester. So why was it important for you to go to Ghana? What did you draw from, particularly maybe thinking about what you learned in D.C. as well?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was the greatest part about actually being there was really sitting down and talking with people and learning about the motivations behind the law. In class, like you said, we read a lot of the legislative statutes and a lot of the explanations, but actually sitting down with the NGOs and the women's groups and talking with them why this was so important to them and what groups they were trying to protect and what groups they may have been trying to exclude by passing these laws was really interesting. And I think that's the same thing that was replicated during my time on the Hill, was talking with groups about their motivations and desires for passing certain legislation. And so I think that it was really illuminating for me. I had a lot of aha moments when you would read something as it was written in the text and then listen to someone's explanation of what that meant to them. And sometimes those two things did not comport with one another. You had to explain to them that what this says is not what you just told me. So it was, I think, having those conversations and, again, being the sounding board for them was really a great aspect of the trip.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question, how do you expect this experience to affect your life as a lawyer going forward? A.B., what about you?
For me, as someone who wants to, I want to be a trial lawyer, the whole experience was the importance of meeting people where they are, not just coming in, we were well-versed, but once again, everyone recognized we weren't Ghanaian, but at the same time, we did know a lot about the laws, especially because we're law students, so we at least knew how to analyze the law. But when we got there, like Ashley said, we would read something and then someone explained to us and the two wouldn't match up. Until someone said, well, this is the viewpoint I'm coming from. What viewpoint are you coming from? And realizing, oh, well, I was thinking about it from the American perspective. I didn't even think, marriage would be viewed in a way like not a partnership. So the importance of when working with clients, meeting them where they are.
That's good. Haley, how about you?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what AB said, especially about coming from different perspectives when you're talking about the same problem. And I think that one of the best parts of this whole trip was learning from all of you guys. And long hours on that bus, just talking about everything. We got into really intense discussions of religion and family and, what is best for Ghana, what's, our imperialist views of things, whether we're being imperialist. I mean, it was really interesting and really, I really think culturally speaking, I learned a lot from my peers and our professors too. And so I think both, seeing not just like the sort of differences, the biggest differences between American views and Ghanaian views, but also just seeing the vast variety of opinions that even our group had about different provisions of the law and about culture was interesting and eye-opening, and I think will carry with me a bit when I'm thinking about being sensitive to differing perspectives, even among people at the same age and the same culture. So,
all right, what's your strongest memory from the trip, Ben?
I mean, I would say, like Haley said, a lot of the conversations on the bus ride were pretty interesting. But, also just sitting in church, we went to a church service on Sunday, which was really interesting. And we got to sit down afterwards to talk with the pastors, with the prayer leaders. And that was really interesting, especially, I forget who said it, but someone was talking about sort of understanding what people were saying, or understanding what people meant when they're not saying something. And so talking to the pastors and asking them about these really sensitive, culturally and religiously sensitive issues, and listening to how they responded to our questions and how they didn't respond to some of our questions was really memorable, and sort of seeing the culture and the music and the vibrancy in the church service was pretty cool.
Katie, what about you?
Two memories stick out for me. One was the slave castle that John spoke about earlier. We went on Independence Day, and it would have been just an emotional experience anyway. But we walked through the door of no return, and it was just really emotional. And especially at the end of the tour was a museum that we would walk through, and we kind of got split up, and so I was walking by myself, and I come to the very end, and they have all these quotes, especially from famous African Americans like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, and it just put the whole history in a new light for me. It was just really emotional. And then the second experience was visiting the girls' school. We went on just one afternoon to speak with some of the teachers and principals there about what the girls were learning and what they're taught about their roles as women and their roles in the family. But the girls were just so full of life and just ecstatic that we were there. They'd touch our hair and our skin and want their pictures taken, and we'd show them on our digital cameras their pictures, and they were just so happy, and that sticks with me and will.
I think we all enjoyed that day with the kids at the school. Abby, what's your strongest memory from the trip?
My strongest memory is probably our most controversial, which was our meeting with the parliamentarians, mainly because it was juicy, but also because it was, like other people have mentioned before, there's one thing to sit there and read, there are some Ghanaians who are opposed to this bill because of the moral. It's another thing to sit down with somebody who is opposing a bill you're essentially advocating for, because we're working with the NGOs, and really understand, really be able to ask them, like, okay, well, why do you think it's immoral, and things like that. So I really valued the perspective because it also allowed us to see the weaknesses of the bill and how we can go about helping with that.
Karen, what's your strongest memory?
I would say twofold, and one was visiting the girls' school, because I think, in a similar perspective, I think just the vibrancy and the life, it kind of put a vivid picture to the people that the Ghanaians were trying to help with these bills, and that, we were supporting them in this initiative. So kind of seeing, who would be the beneficiaries, hopefully, of those laws. And I think second, something that really stuck with me is that there's a real degree of formality in greeting and meeting. And so every time we would sit down at a meeting, the beginning would always be spent in introductions of, they would start and they'd explain who they were, and they would welcome us, and then we would explain who we were and why we were coming. And I thought it expressed a value, I think, to each and every interaction that can sometimes get lost in our quick, phone call, get an answer type interaction. So I really appreciated that and felt that really deepened my understanding of Ghanaian culture and reinforced that idea of being a student and really learning from this experience.
Okay, last question for me before I open it up. So what else did you learn from this experience? Chris, anything?
Oh, we don't have time for all of that.
Pick one thing.
Well, I guess talking a lot about all the different people who we met with, I was really impressed that people were so open with us, even though sometimes they wouldn't directly say how they felt. They were expressing their views, and people didn't seem to be holding back because we were from somewhere else or because we were affiliated with a certain NGO or a certain stance on the bill. So I really appreciated that people were so willing to talk to us about all of this and take time out of their extremely busy schedules for a group of people just passing through for a week.
Candace, how about you?
I think one of the biggest takeaways for me was when we were there and talking with these parliamentarians and realizing how much work there is to be done in order for people to think of marriage as a partnership and think of taking care of kids and family and giving someone else the option to go to work as contribution, those kind of big mental shifts. And then coming back here and thinking that we've gone through that exact same process in the States, and we've gone through all sorts of social justice movements and are still going through them, and understanding how much work and dedication, and that people sometimes I think feel like they're banging their heads up against a wall, but you're not, because those slow changes accumulate over time. And it's also just with all of the, I think this question of whether there's a war on women here has made me take my rights as a woman more seriously coming back from the trip. I think I took them for granted before we went over.
Allie, you have anything?
Yeah, so one thing that I was thinking of during the trip, because this is obviously a topic that is really infused with your gender politics, is I think I kind of assumed, because when you look at the laws, this seems like backwards in terms of our stages of feminism. Like, I think I underestimated like the strength of the feminist movement in Ghana, even if maybe that's not how they would characterize it. For instance, when we were talking to the teachers at the girls' school and I had asked them about maternity leave policies, they were laughing. They were like, maternity leave? Like, we just have a baby and come back. Like, these people are working really, really hard with fewer resources, and I just felt really impressed by the women there.
Emily, you have anything?
Sure. One of the other lessons I learned, which some members of the group had already learned, was this was my first experience working on a legal project in an international setting. And so for me, I really had to learn how to put some of these cultural assumptions aside. And some of them we've talked about multiple times, the idea of marriage as a partnership and other things. And so we were often reminded when we were there in meetings that the cultural framework is very different. And so, like Avi was talking about earlier, when she asked, I don't understand, you said you mean this, but the law says this, and we realized our cultural framework was different, and we had to constantly remind ourselves of that. And that experience taught me how important it is, and also how hard it is, and how you have to be checking yourself very often when you're working in a different country.
Thanks. Are there questions from folks here? Yeah, Esther.
Yes. I think that part of the issue is also that we are learning to become married the way ordinance law expects. Because even growing up as a child, you know, you have the women's household and men's household. This idea of two people in a house in the same bed is so foreign. You get up at night, you go to your husband's home, which is the men's home, you come back to your house by 6 a.m., and you go do your work. So understanding of marriage as partnership and property that is joined, that you're going to be sharing, is very foreign, and all of that tinges what we're trying to do 50 years hence of independence.
Thank you. Your questions? Anybody? Yes.
I was just wondering with the project on custom law, what did you do in the future? Years ago.
For
Like different countries and things like that? Or
I'll turn that over to Professors Helfer and Bradley up here to see what they say.
Well, there are two things going on. So we have this year-long project on custom and law, which was designed just for this particular year, which is focused on a lot of other things. We've had a lot of speakers this year talking about all aspects of custom and how it interacts with American law and other laws. And we were fortunate to be able to combine it with this service-oriented trip associated with this class this year. But we've also had those sorts of classes in a couple of other years that are not connected to the custom project. And I did one a year ago in Jerusalem with a group of students, and Professor Helfer's done one in Brazil. We've also done some work in Haiti as well as a part of that. And that, I think, of some version or another, will continue in the years to come. As to whether we'll have it particularly about custom, that may or may not continue, because we're actually finishing that year with a big faculty symposium that'll eventually come out next year, but that may be the end of that year-long project. But we'll continue these sorts of experiential trips, I think.
So if you have ideas for that, I mean, I would say we've kind of passed the baton now for 3 years, so if there are particular faculty members for whom you have ideas, persuade them to, that's how it started, by the way.
Yeah.
It was a group of students who came to me and said, we want to do something where we can make a difference, but also learn and understand the cultural context in which a particular legal issue is emerging, and that led to the first trip to Brazil and to a series of contexts that have since grown. So I think it's largely dependent on student initiative, and I think the faculty as a whole is receptive. Another thing I'll say is I think we'd like to kind of institutionalize this, that is to have, there are plans that we hope we can, starting next year, have an international human rights clinic. We'll see if that happens, but if it does, then that will, a lot of this sort of activity may get folded into that.
Other questions? Yeah.
You spoke about having to bring books over there because of the lack of infrastructure, I guess, to get information out to the people. How does that affect how, I guess, information about the bills is kind of communicated to people? When you met with the girls' schools and such, were they aware of this pending legislation, or how'd that go?
You all want to, who wants to field that? Okay, Ashley?
Well, part of the material we're working on now, the FAQs, is planned to be distributed. One of the ways that information is distributed widely, because there are some very rural parts of Ghana as opposed to the urban center of Accra, is through radio show discussions. So we're planning to distribute those FAQs to radio hosts so that when they have nightly shows talking about this issue, they have some material to go through to answer people's questions and disseminate that information. Also, the girls' school had a formal civics class where the girls are actually learning about the Constitution and about things like domestic violence and marriage. And so they are very aware of these bills, and also teaching those about teaching the bills to the younger generation. So It is a task to try to reach all those different groups, but there definitely is structures in place now that keeps in mind the younger generation and also some of the more rural or harder to reach areas.
Anybody else want to add anything? Yeah, Carrie?
I'll add to that just briefly. I think as well that's one of the issues that we identified when we were prior to going to Ghana as a challenge, in that there have been several judicial opinions, for example, that have interpreted the current law in a way that would be favorable to men and women as in a more partnership-like relationship. However, those decisions have not been, there's not broad awareness of them, they're not broadly disseminated, judges may be unaware, litigants even less aware of that precedent. So that's part of the rationale behind the FAQs. Even if the bills don't pass right away, there will be more information about this precedent available so people can understand more judicial remedies rather than a statutory remedy for their rights.
Yeah, Haley?
I'll just add that it's not so much that there's not awareness of the existence of these bills and of the existing law. It's more incorrect assumptions about them, and sometimes the controversy is fueled by misunderstanding. So the cohabitation provision we heard a lot about, and there was a lot of concern that it might allow people that are in these monogamous by law marriages to like have a girlfriend, and suddenly the girlfriend is basically stealing property from the wife, when that actually would not be permitted under the law. And there were similar sort of issues with the ISB. People were under the impression that it only applied to matrilineal societies where children are also divested of their father's property on death, when in fact they are applicable to both patrilineal and matrilineal society. So it's not so much lack of awareness, it's just lack of full understanding. And I think that there's what we're doing, but also what a lot of the NGOs and government agencies are doing, are trying to shore up some of those misunderstandings and make mediators and judges and religious officials that do some of this in real life more empowered to get the law right.
John?
Yeah, I think the fact that there are any nationwide campaigns there at all really speaks to the vibrancy of the civil society there. I think we were all really impressed by the people we met in the NGOs and the public interest attorneys. These are like actual heroes, like working with this incredible energy and sense of urgency and humility and professionalism, just going on these rugged back roads to rural areas of Ghana and meeting with like the queen mothers and the chiefs and the district assemblymen of all these different regions, and speaking to them in a way that gets them fired up. And they've had past successes, and they're planning to, they're confident that this will be a success too, and they're working really hard at it.
One of their big successes 5 years ago was passage of a domestic violence bill. And one of the meetings that we held with NGO leaders was with people who had passed that law. And one of the things that they stressed was the importance of having, basically speaking with a same voice, to make sure that you stayed, and we would put it staying on message, and making sure you had sound bites and things to deliver the message consistently. But it was also a really good example of how they had worked very, very hard, had revamped their strategy at various points where they needed to, and it had an immense success in a law that is really helping to pave the way for these. So I think part of what we're trying to do is to sort of help them stay on message and get the message out and use their resources in a way as efficiently as possible. Professor Helfer?
So one question I have is, what happens if at least one of the bills passes? And that's a great segue from the comment that Professor Bradley just made, in that there was a bill that was passed that was in a related area, and then there was the question of implementation and access to justice, and whether that actually happened. So what the frequently asked questions that you're talking about relate to both the bill and more broadly to the relevant issues, even if the bill doesn't pass. But if one of the bills passes, do you have any ideas, or did you discuss with your partners in Ghana ways in which you might actually work on implementation?
Yeah, Candace?
I know that was something we talked about on the bus pretty often, and women or anyone there can have access to justice not just through going to a court, but also going to a church leader or a tribal leader or something like that. So we talked about getting that information to those kind of key people, the pivotal people that will be making those decisions at every level, so that the information will kind of filter down through those smaller decisions.
I think one of the things we learned and we sort of had emphasized over and over again was that it's not just working through law, or through the court system. You've got to be working through a whole network of systems, and there's a lot of systems in place as long as you can get people, sort of pointed in the right direction. Other questions? Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the students for enlightening everyone.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.